Hey guys, it's me, Kamil Rückert again, and in today's student lecture we'll be talking about migration and somatization. How are those topics connected? Are there any studies? And what can we as natives or as immigrants learn from it? The original presentation picture was Neo Rauch's painting Stellwerk 2, and if you're interested to look it up online, feel free to do so, because for me it best describes the diffuse emotional world connected to migration. I took it down because the gallery apparently has a tough copyright policy and I'm just a student with limited funds. So today's art is Jacob Lawrence, panel 40 from the Migration series. The picture is taken from the MoMA exhibition Migration and Movement. And well, as usual, let's jump right in with the question, what is migration? The objective definition I found here was first, it is a movement from one place to another with the intention of settling down permanently. And secondly, it is the movement of people to a new area or country in order to find work or better living conditions. But for me, both definitions exclude an emotional quality and focus solely on the objective movement to another place. Migration includes a subjective definition, personal to each participant. It is an experience of two different emotional and social worlds. It often involves a loss of identity and it challenges personal ideas of culture. Last but not least, it is also an experience of separation. May this be from our parents, our loved ones, or maybe from the culture itself. In this way, it may even be present in intra-national migration or in the simple act of moving. And though Europe, for example, seems to have a similar coherent culture, living in Spain may drastically differ from living in Latvia. So in some way, one can argue that migration is different from movement in a subjectively felt distress in the adaptation process. The German professor Machleit illustrates the functional adaptation and the experience of distress in the following graph. Migration often starts with two highs. The preparation, the act of migration, as well as the phase of overcompensation include a positive functional adaptation. This may last for a few weeks or months, for some maybe years, and is often described as the honeymoon phase known to lovers and newly married. Once the peak of adaptation is reached, the decline starts. The factors leading to this inadequate adaptation will be mentioned later. But for now, let's just say that negative emotions, experiences, and conflicts may lead to this. If, and only if this stage is resolved, the migrants can continue to the stage of mourning and critical adaptation. So, when do you think somatization kicks in? And I think if you watched my previous videos, you can already guess it. Somatization begins when the patient cannot overcome the negative effects or emotions. The defense mechanisms of somatization kicks in. The felt distress and the unconscionable conflicts cause our neurotransmitters and hormones to have an effect on us. Only if the emotions and the distress is faced, let's say with professional help, the stage can continue. And before I talk about the distress and the pathophysiology, let's take a look at the following. This is my own subjective experience, as well as an illustration to show how I think most, or maybe some students of other universities felt. This is an Riga Stradan student adaptation, but I won't go too much into depth or into detail. If you're interested in this graph and want an explanation, since you're an RSU student, just let me know and I will send you a transcript. So, what causes stress? What causes stress may be quite obvious and objective. The immigrant may experience real or felt injustice. They may have to deal with cultural differences, lack of support from their families and peers. They have anxiety about the future, and obviously, there's a language barrier. While this promotes distress, internal conflicts lead to distress too. In Germany, the OPD, Arbeitsgemeinschaft für operationalisierte psychodynamische Diagnostik, developed a tool to diagnose a patient in different axes. One of them deals with the internal conflicts. At the core of psychoanalysis and psychodynamic psychotherapy is the conflict. Two entities which we both want, or two qualities that yet seem to not be able to coexist. Those are conflicts we all may experience, and I just wanted to point out four of them that, in my opinion, may become quite prominent in case of migration. But I won't go too much into detail, and hopefully I'll manage to make a lecture about those conflicts in the future. So, as I mentioned, migration may cause stress. Medicine divides between good stress and bad stress. The good stress, eustress, keeps you going, and the bad stress, called distress, is the prolonged negative stress that pushes you down. In my first lecture, Is Psychosomatics Real?, I already showed this graph. Slightly changed, but at the core it's still the same. And since repetition lies at the core of learning, I will quickly repeat it one more time. Distress or long-term exposure to stress increases our hormone levels. Cortisol rises and affects our metabolism and immune system, while the adrenaline and noradrenaline affect our effector systems. These include our muscles and organs. The longer the exposure precedes, the worse. These hormones actually increase the feeling of helplessness, and this triggers an even larger production of them. At the same time, the gene expression in the hypothalamus and hypophysis is increased and leads to an additional higher production, which is also connected to the previous mentioned. This all leads to damage to the limbic system and eventually leads to a vicious circle. As a rule, it seems that long-term exposure to distress or severe distress changes the brain structure and the hormones increase. And this leads to an overall susceptibility to somatic disorders and is triggered by itself. So let's summarize for 1 second. Migration may cause distress due to the objective and subjective factors, yet the normal life of native citizens is not necessarily a straight line either. Problems connected to migrations are known to all of us and maybe help in establishing some empathy. We all have internal conflicts and anxiety, yet migration may be a risk factor since it may trigger subclinical internal conflicts. Some of your acquaintances may say, well, conflict and all this social quality is nonsense, especially in medicine. But keep in mind the WHO definition for health. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. This definition is a quite political one and forces medical students and future doctors to look at the universal suffering in the world. Migration is omnipresent in our times, with the European refugee crisis, conflicts and wars in the world, the economic disbalance or misbalance between the Western world and the rest, and last but not least, with the modern right at the rise of somewhat hidden fascism, or more open fascism these days. But before this becomes too political, let's take a look at 2 interesting research I've found. You can find the sources at the end of the presentation, but for now let me just summarize. The first research deals with Russian immigration in Western cultures, especially in Northern America, and it's a literature review summarizing a lot of facts. And this study illustrates the cultural differences and emotional norms in this group. And while some Russian immigrants are adapting well, others show elevated levels of depressive symptoms, somatization, and alcoholism. And another study even suggests 75% of all Russian immigrants to suffer from depressive symptoms and psychosomatic complaints. And this number is huge and may be a good example for the suffering and migration, cultural differences, and maybe socioeconomic disadvantages. It also illustrates how two cultures are at its core quite different. Russian speakers differ in some way in their form of collectivism, gender relations, social support, parenting styles. They have this paradoxical mix of modern and traditional values that one could argue the Western world does not have. It's a much more progressive form of culture. And well, the second study, since I'm from Germany, is quite interesting for me. It deals with Turkish foreign workers in Germany. Um, and in the late 60s and 70s, Germany was looking for labor and invited Turkish immigrants to come to Germany as foreign workers. And quite early on, studies were conducted on their health. The biggest influence on their health and in their feeling of health was the role of separation from their families, the separation from a known cultural environment, and the verbal and social isolation. Their health was checked on arrival after 3 months and after 18 months. Already after 3 months, a quarter of the immigrants displayed psychiatric abnormalities with mainly depressive symptoms. After 18 months, 1/3 of the workers was diagnosed as mentally ill, which may be due to the fact that the study is from the 1970s. And this mental illness was mainly psychosomatic complaints. So now we're already reaching the last slides. Well, you might have asked yourself, what are the specific psychosomatic disorders? What are the symptoms? The German literature mainly focuses on pain disorders in immigrants. Pain disorders are functional pains due to no underlying obvious reasons. And in psychodynamic theory, unexpressed emotions and conflicts find a way to express themselves. Often, this emotional quality in immigrants is not fully expressed and acknowledged. Sadness, mourning, and anger may be due to the same reasons and the same conflicts that lead to these disorders. Just ask yourself, how would you feel angry or sad if you could not communicate with the members of your family or with all members of your family? How do you feel if your child would grow up in a different culture with different values? Or how would you feel if after 20 or 30 years of migration, you critically look back at your own biography and compare yourself with your old friends and acquaintances from your home country? I think in the media and often what the modern right does is they draw this picture of invaders that come to our country and they try to take over. But let's not forget that migration itself is not a pleasant experience, necessarily necessarily a nice experience to go through. It can be hard on yourself, and you need to accept or allow yourself to show those emotions too. So another reason for these pain disorders may also be something that could be called attention seeking, especially in elderly women. Yet not in the sense of high school students, but rather as a part of an aging process. In traditional families, the woman is responsible for the functional support. She cooks, she cleans, and organizes the schedule. In the normal aging process, a loss of these functions may occur, and the woman or the women may not feel like they fully that they are a fully functioning member of the family. In order to be again integrated in the family, they may often form symptoms. So, thank you for listening, but also keep in mind, because I feel like this lecture was quite negative in some ways and drew a rather negative picture of migration. Let's not forget that migration is not completely harmful. Though it should be regarded as an important and stressful life event, it may even enrich our lives and open rooms of actions for the individual. So here are my sources, feel free to go through them. Unfortunately, as you already know, most of them are German, and then there's one French and one English one between them. Bye bye.